Just very briefly about Military Court Watch. We're a group mainly of lawyers, 12 of us, focusing essentially on the first 24 hours of treatment of children prosecuted in the military courts. We have 6 recommendations. So we take a very sort of focused legal approach to our work. With the idea of if you get the right group of professionals together focusing on one point, one issue, and just a 24-hour period in that issue, can you have some sort of impact? And we are seeing some movement in the recommendations. Nothing of real substance yet. It's more form over substance, but I'll talk a little bit more about that in due course. Okay, so starting on the issue of child detention, I think a good place to start is with the UNICEF report. So in March of last year, UNICEF published this report, Children in Israeli Military Detention. You can find it online, it's on our website. What UNICEF did is they reviewed 400 sworn testimonies taken from children prosecuted in the system throughout 2012 and I think 2011. And they came up with one conclusion. And that conclusion was that ill treatment in the system is widespread, systematic, and institutionalized. And what I would like to talk a little bit about now is that phrase, widespread, systematic, and institutionalized, and try and put that into some sort of context and give some explanation as to why is that so. Before I start, a few other pieces of information that I think are useful to know. Obviously, you appreciate that military law, martial law, was imposed in the West Bank, Israeli martial law, in June 1967. It's been in place ever since. According to UN figures, since June 1967, a conservative estimate is 750,000 men, women and children have been prosecuted in the military courts. 750,000 men, women and children. It's mostly men. According to the military authorities, last year 1,004 children were arrested. And the military courts have jurisdiction over children as young as 12 years old. The overwhelming majority of children, though, in the system tend to be 16 and 17-year-olds. That's the main age bracket. So, looking at that phrase, widespread, systematic and institutionalized, and the numbers, 750,000 people detained in the system, what has intrigued me in doing this work for the last 7 years is to ask the question, why? Why have so many people been put through this system? What is the purpose and the objective of the system? Now, to understand that, I think you have to appreciate what the primary objective of the Israeli military is in the West Bank. And this is no secret. Military commanders will readily explain what their primary purpose is, and that is to protect the settlers. You probably saw a little bit of that today at Bilin. It's slightly removed from the settlers, but it's part of that same process of clamping down on protest, any form of resistance, peaceful or otherwise. Now, according to the latest data, there's something like 580,000 settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. We're just looking at the West Bank, because as you know, Israel has unilaterally annexed East Jerusalem, so they apply their civilian law to that location. No one recognizes that, but that's the system of law they apply, whereas military law is in the West Bank, and that's just what we're focusing on today. So in the West Bank, the number of settlers is around 380,000. It's getting very close to 400,000. Now, thinking about that, the primary purpose of the military is to protect the settlers in the West Bank, nearly 400,000. That strikes me as quite possibly one of the hardest military tasks any army could be given, to guarantee the protection of 400,000 civilians essentially wandering around occupied territory. And I like to think of it another way. Imagine this for a moment. Imagine if, say, Britain or America decided to put 400,000 American or British civilians into Afghanistan and told them, go and build towns and villages, shopping malls, roads, schools, etc., etc. Can you imagine the level of violence and bloodshed that would result from that scenario? And yet that's exactly what has occurred in the West Bank for the last 47 years. Now, where I think this story gets even more remarkable is every year the US State Department puts out a global report on human rights. So according to the US State Department, in 2012, no settlers were killed in the West Bank. That strikes me as extraordinary. Last year, 2 settlers were killed, and this year, 5 settlers have been killed in the West Bank. Now, when I raise these figures, I don't do so in order to trivialize those deaths when they occur. But you do need to look at the objective data. And the objective data, according to the US State Department, is that in the last 3 years, out of 400,000, nearly 400,000 Israeli civilians living in occupied territory in the West Bank, 7 have been killed. Now that strikes me as extraordinary. And the question is, how on earth has the Israeli military achieved that? And again, I'd like you to imagine for a moment that situation in Afghanistan, and I think you would find much higher casualty rates. And the way it has essentially been done, and this is where it links into people being prosecuted in the military courts and child detention, the way it's done is essentially through mass intimidation and collective punishment on a grand scale, and performed very successfully and very efficiently. And what I'd like to do now is to describe to you just how that process works on a day-to-day basis. Now, as you would probably imagine, the West Bank is divided up into a number of military jurisdictions, small military jurisdictions, and in charge of each of those military jurisdictions is a relatively junior military officer. So within each small military jurisdiction in the West Bank, such as Berlin where you were at today, that junior officer might be in charge of one settlement. They might have something like 600 people living in it, and maybe 4 or 5 Palestinian villages. And like I said, his job is to guarantee the protection of those 600 Israeli civilians living amongst those 3 or 4 Palestinian villages. Now, imagine for a moment you're that junior military officer. You're sitting at your desk one day, telephone rings, it's a call from the local settlement. They tell you that a group of Palestinians have been seen at a section of the road within your jurisdiction throwing stones at either military vehicles or settler buses, settler cars. You, as that junior military officer, you know that if you order a couple of jeeps to go and investigate, by the time you get there, those people are long gone. You're not going to find anyone there. So that poses a dilemma for you. You have people who are resisting you within the jurisdiction, in some cases throwing stones at the road. And when we talk about throwing stones, you have to appreciate that covers a whole range of circumstances, from the trivial. So, for example, you get cases where children have gone to prison for throwing stones at the wall being a military installation, right up to very serious situations. You don't need much of imagination to know that if you throw a rock through the windscreen of a car travelling at 70 kilometres an hour, you can cause a lot of damage and you could kill someone. So it's a whole range of things. So I don't want anyone to think that stone throwing is invariably trivial. It's not. It's a whole. You have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. But getting back to our example, you're that junior military officer. You know that people have been throwing stones. They will have run off. What do you do about that? You've got a choice. You can either say, well, maybe we can try and set an ambush tomorrow, try and catch some people tomorrow. Maybe we'll get lucky, maybe we won't. But we don't know who the perpetrators are, so there's not much we can do about that. The problem is, if you take that course of action, that incident of resistance went unpunished. And the problem is, if you continue with that practice of not punishing every act of resistance that occurs, you're going to find quite quickly that you will lose control of your jurisdiction. It will embolden the people who are resisting. They know they can get away with it. And you'll pretty quickly find that you'll lose control of that section of road. The settlers will probably start taking the law into their own hands because they won't tolerate that. And there's a good chance within a week or so you'll have chaos in your jurisdiction. If that happens, you'll be out of a job pretty quickly. So that's not an option. But again, what do you do when people are resisting and you cannot identify the perpetrators? Essentially what you do is this. what you do is you begin by making a number of assumptions. First assumption you make is that the people who were throwing stones were young males, probably aged between 10 and 30 years old. And I think that's a fair assumption. Now, when I talk about these assumptions, I'm not talking about something you could get a conviction in a court of law. I'm talking just a basic sort of military assumption based on common sense. The second assumption you'll make is that those young males came from the nearest Palestinian village. And again, that's a fair assumption. If you're Palestinian, you don't have to commute very far. You're not going to commute across the West Bank to throw stones at someone. You can do it near your village. And so those assumptions, I think, are fair assumptions. What you will then do with those assumptions is you'll hand that information over to the intelligence officer in charge of that locality. So just as the West Bank is divided up into military jurisdictions, it's divided also up into intelligence jurisdictions. For those of you who've seen the documentary The Gatekeeper, the Gatekeepers, they spoke a little bit about that, how every Palestinian center of population has assigned to it an Israeli intelligence officer. And that intelligence officer's job is basically to know everything there is to know about that village. How many people live there, obviously. Who's married to who. Political affiliations. Who's Hamas, who's Fatah. Importantly, who's been in prison before in that village. Given that 750,000 people have been through this system, you can be fairly sure there will be people who have been in prison in that village. And so just as happens from time to time in Britain, in America, in many jurisdictions around the world, when the police don't have a clue as to who to arrest, you can start with rounding up a few of the usual suspects. So there's a little bit of that going on. But the most important role that the intelligence officer will play is he or she will look to see who are the informants in that village. Now, after 47 years of occupation, there's a wide network of Palestinian informants throughout the West Bank. I've heard figures of upwards of 20,000 informants in the West Bank. Now, impossible to get hard evidence of that because no one's going to stick up their hand and say they're an informant, they're a collaborator. But when we review the evidence of children being interrogated, in many cases that's an aspect of the interrogation process. One aspect will be to try and get that child to give up names of other people in the village. And in some cases, there'll be an active attempt to recruit that child for ongoing intelligence purposes. There was something recently published in Haaretz newspaper about a month ago, which referred to Unit 8000 in the Israeli army. I don't know whether you read it or heard about it. This is an intelligence unit, and basically what it does something similar in some respects to the NSA. So it collects massive amounts of data from the internet, from people's internet usage, from emails, etc., etc. And they're looking for anything that can be used to turn someone, anything that can be used or be seen as a perceived weakness. So, for example, you might try to identify who's gay in the community. Anything that you can use to recruit someone as a collaborator will be used. And so that figure of 20,000 really doesn't surprise me. So what the intelligence officer will do is he will see if there are any informants in the village, make contact with them, find out if that informant is aware of anyone in the village saying they've been throwing stones at the road. From those various sources, the intelligence officer will compile a list of names. That list of names will then go back to that junior military officer, and then the junior military officer will plan a raid on that village within a few days to arrest those people. The net is frequently cast quite wide, and in many respects that serves a very useful purpose. You may, in the general sweep, you may pick up people who have been throwing stones, whether at that particular occasion or some other occasion. But even if you pick up people who haven't been throwing stones, the mere fact of arresting them and putting them through the system I'll describe has quite a profound effect on that community. And if you're that junior military officer who's charged with the task of guaranteeing the protection of those 600 settlers, that is your primary aim. You have to intimidate the local population who live around that settlement so they do not resist. And essentially that's the process that's followed. So what will happen next is either during the day or night, the military will go into the village. The intelligence is excellent. They will, I think in 7 years I've done this work, probably 4 or 5 occasions that they got the wrong house. If it's at night, the first thing the family will know about anything is the house will be surrounded. There'll be a huge commotion outside. They'll look out the window and they'll see the house surrounded by military vehicles and the military. If the military goes in during the day, different dynamics are involved in going into a village during the day. As you'd probably appreciate, if an Israeli military convoy goes into a Palestinian village during the day, there's a good chance young men will start throwing stones at it, which means there'll be clashes, tear gas, rubber bullets, etc., etc. In that situation, Palestinians are going to get hurt. There's a chance Israeli soldiers might get hurt. Now, sometimes that might be the desired objective, to create this chaos. But if that's not the desired objective, to create a sort of a riot, then the military will go in at night time. Usually around 2 o'clock in the morning is the general time. Once the house is surrounded, there'll be very loud banging on the front door. If the door's not opened up quickly, the door will be kicked in generally or blown off its hinges. In a smaller number of cases, the military have a device which they can use to take the door off its hinges without making any sound. So they'll come into the village quietly, no one will wake up, remove the door from its hinges, enter the house, enter the bedrooms, and the first thing the family will know about any of this is there will be soldiers in the bedrooms. Again, if your job is to intimidate people, that's an excellent way of doing it. Either way, the family will be gathered in one room of the house. The commanding officer will have the list of names. He will ask for the ID cards of the family, and he will compare the ID cards with the list of names and identify the people they've come to arrest. Once they've been identified, they'll be separated from the rest of the family, generally tied with a zip tie and blindfolded. To give you an idea of, and I think this is partly the product of 47 years of this, how casual and informal the whole process can be sometimes. We come from places where we expect arrest warrants and we expect a lot of paperwork and procedures, etc., etc. Most of the time during these arrest processes, there is no paperwork other than that list of names. Now, in the last year, we've been seeing a little bit more paperwork. Like the family is sometimes now, it's a new development, being given a bit of paper telling them where their child is going to be taken for interrogation. But that only happens in about 10% of cases. But what's interesting is we've documented a number of cases this year where the commanding officer didn't even have the list of names. The names of the people he came to arrest were written on his hand. And the only thing I can think of is that a couple of hours before he was at a briefing, being told, you have to go into this village, etc., etc., didn't have any paper with him, and so he just wrote people's names on his hand. That's how informal sometimes this whole process can be. The scene in the house, as you can imagine, will be massively chaotic. You were at Berlin, many of these households are large, many small children frequently. The small children are usually crying and screaming. Remember, there'll be a lot of soldiers outside the house. About 10 or so soldiers will enter the house. And these soldiers will be in full battle gear. M16s, they will also have camouflage faces, helmets on. So for the little children, 2 o'clock in the morning, extremely terrifying situation. They'll be screaming and crying. The parents will be shouting at the commanding officer, demanding information. Why are you arresting my son? Where are you taking him to? All of that stuff. Like I said, in some small number of cases, the commanding officer will hand the parents a bit of paper, but in most cases there'll be no information. The soldiers then will take the person out of the house. The family will follow. The parents will still be shouting for information. And at that point, generally the soldiers will point their weapons at the family and tell them to get back into the house. They'll then